For 20 years, I have listened to my son-in-law, Pastor Alistair Finch, preach about sacrifice while his own pockets grew heavy with the offerings of the faithful. He stands on that gleaming stage, bathed in soft, forgiving light. His voice a rich baritone that can coax tears from stone and dollars from the desperate. He calls me a bitter old woman. My daughter Sarah, his devoted wife, her eyes shining with a fervor that mirrors his, tells me I should be grateful for the crumbs they offer, for this small, sterile apartment tucked away in a forgotten corner of the sprawling Hope Community megachurch campus. They think these four walls, with their beige paint and utilitarian furniture, are my world, the sum total of my 70 years. They have no idea what I have built within them, within the quiet solitude they so readily assigned me. I have built an archive of their deceit. The sound of Alistair's televised Sunday sermon, a regular feature now, syndicated across several Christian networks, drifts into my small living room. His voice, magnified and sanctimonious, is talking about the widow's mite, about giving until it hurts. On the screen, his hand adorned with a watch I recognize, a gold chronograph with a sapphire inset, the kind that costs more than I saw in a year when my dear Arthur was alive, gestures emphatically. That watch, I recall with the clarity that indignation provides, was purchased during a supposed mission trip to Haiti, a trip for which the congregation had donated tens of thousands of dollars to bring hope and healing to earthquake survivors. I saw the discreet jeweler's bag tucked into his luggage when he returned, the satisfied gleam in his eye that had nothing to do with spiritual fulfillment. I rise from my worn armchair, the one Arthur and I bought half a century ago, its floral pattern faded, but its springs still strong, like my resolve. I walk to the old wooden secretary desk in the corner, another relic from a life they cannot comprehend, a life of genuine faith and modest means. I unlock a deep drawer, and from it, I retrieve a heavy, locked wooden box. The key, a small, tarnished silver one, hangs on a chain around my neck, resting against my skin, a constant reminder. Inside the box, nestled in neat, chronological order, are my ledgers. Not ledgers of household accounts, but ledgers of their transgressions. Thin notebooks filled with my precise, spidery handwriting, detailing dates, amounts, suspicious expenditures. Alongside them are photographs, glossy prints of them on luxury vacations disguised as church retreats, photocopies of invoices for custom suits and designer gowns, printouts of property deeds for undeclared assets held in shell corporations. USB drives contain audio files, snippets of conversations I was never meant to hear, digital copies of bank statements that found their way to me through channels Alistair would never suspect. It is the pain of my daughter's transformation that cuts the deepest. Sarah, my bright, compassionate Sarah, who once dreamed of being a veterinarian, who cried when a bird fell from its nest. Now she looks at me with a cool pity, her compassion reserved for the image her husband has so carefully crafted. "Mother," she will say, her voice laced with the weary condescension she learned from Alistair, "you simply do not understand the pressures of ministry at this level. These are not extravagances. They are necessities, tools for God's work." She parrots his lines, her own thoughts seemingly erased, replaced by his insidious rhetoric. My isolation here is not just physical. It is a profound emotional banishment, a consequence of my refusal to applaud their hypocrisy. If you are listening to this story, thank you so much for being here. Drop a comment and tell us where you are right now. We love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. And do not forget to subscribe to become part of our growing community. My days here are measured, predictable. I tend the small patch of herbs I am allowed outside my back door. I read. I watched the comings and goings of the church staff, the earnest faces of the congregation flocking to hear Alistair's words, their trust so openly, so vulnerably given. From my invisible position, I see much. I see the fawning sycophants who surround Alistair, the subtle fear in the eyes of those who dare to question even minor decisions. I hear the whispers, the rumors that never quite reach the pulpit, or if they do, are swiftly dismissed as the work of detractors, of those lacking in faith. There was a time long ago when Sarah was different. I remember her as a girl, her pigtails flying as she ran through the fields behind our small house in Ohio. Her laughter was like wind chimes. She had a tender heart, a fierce sense of fairness. That was before Alistair Finch swept into her life, a charming, ambitious young seminary student who saw in Sarah not just a pretty face, but a stepping stone. I had misgivings even then, a faint unease I could not articulate, a sense that his smile did not quite reach his eyes. But Sarah was smitten, and I, a widowed mother wanting only her daughter's happiness, held my tongue, a mistake I have regretted every day since. The Hope Community megachurch is an empire. Gleaming glass and steel, a state-of-the-art auditorium that seats thousands, television studios, a bookstore brimming with Alistair's bestsellers, even a coffee shop that sells blessed brew at inflated prices. It is a far cry from the humble storefront church where Alistair began his ministry, the one where my Arthur and I first met him, when his suits were off the rack and his ambition was still a flickering candle rather than a raging inferno. Their own home, a veritable mansion in a gated community miles away from the church, is something I have only seen in the glossy pages of a lifestyle magazine spread that featured Pastor Finch, a life of service and style, and on a few deeply uncomfortable mandatory visits for holidays, where I felt more like an exhibit than family. The opulence was suffocating, every surface polished, every room a testament to wealth I knew the congregation could not imagine their pastor possessing. Yesterday, Alistair and Sarah paid one of their infrequent, perfunctory visits to my apartment. Alistair, all false bonhomie and practiced sincerity, surveyed my small living room with an air of magnanimous ownership. "Esther," he said, his voice smooth as oiled silk, "you must be so comfortable here. The church takes good care of its own, a peaceful place for your golden years." He conveniently forgot that this care came with the implicit understanding that I remained silent, invisible. Sarah, meanwhile, drifted to the window, checking her phone, her boredom palpable. She wore a new silk blouse, the kind with a discreet designer label I recognized from one of Alistair's credit card statements I had once glimpsed. "Mother, Alistair works so hard for the Lord. These are just blessings," she said, a rote recitation, turning to show off an expensive new handbag, a crocodile skin monstrosity that probably cost more than my yearly Social Security benefits. "You should try to be happy for us. All this negativity is not good for your spirit." The condescension, the casual dismissal of my feelings, was like a fresh stab to an old wound. But it was later that day, during his televised sermon, that the final piece of my resolve clicked into place. Alistair, his face a mask of earnest concern, announced the Week of Hope, the church's largest annual fundraising campaign. "My dear brothers and sisters," he intoned, his voice trembling with emotion, "this year we are launching our most ambitious outreach yet. A new center for the homeless, a place of refuge and renewal. We need to raise $50 million to make this dream a reality. $50 million to bring God's love to the least of these." The camera panned across the tearful faces in the congregation, hands already reaching for checkbooks. Later that evening, I was watering my small rosemary bush when Alistair strode past, deep in a phone conversation, too self-important to notice me. The evening air was still, and his voice carried clearly. "Yes, the custom interior will take a bit longer," he was saying, a note of impatience in his tone. "But make sure the down payment is processed quickly. Use the discretionary funds from the new campaign. The early pledges are already pouring in. And for heaven's sake, tell them I want the obsidian black, not the standard. The Lord has blessed us, might as well reflect it." A luxury car, custom. Paid for with money meant for the homeless. The sheer, unadulterated gall of it stole my breath. That night, the image of his smug face, the sound of his callous words, burned in my mind. This was not just greed. It was a mockery of every decent person who placed their trust in him. I went to my wooden box. I pulled out the master ledger, a thick, cloth-bound volume I had labeled, with a grim sense of irony, God's true accounting. I opened my worn desk calendar and circled the date of Alistair's keynote sermon for the Week of Hope, the grand finale of the fundraising drive. "The Week of Hope," I murmured to the empty room, my voice surprisingly steady. "Indeed. Hope for the truth to finally see the light of day. Your judgment day is coming, Alistair, but it will not be the one you preach about." A cold, clear purpose settled over me. The time for silent observation was over. I began the painstaking process of selecting and digitizing the most damning pieces of evidence from my 20-year collection. The years of being dismissed, undervalued, and betrayed had forged not bitterness, as they claimed, but a diamond-hard resolve. They have paraded their piety for years, living like royalty on the hopes and sacrifices of good, hard-working people. They have built an empire on a foundation of lies, callously dismissing anyone who dared to glimpse the cracks. Now, their carefully constructed world is about to face a reckoning they never saw coming, a reckoning orchestrated by the bitter old woman they thought they had safely tucked away. What would you do if you were in my shoes, watching your own family, your own daughter, betray everything you held sacred? Whose side are you on as this story unfolds? The weeks leading up to the Week of Hope became a blur of clandestine activity within the confines of my small apartment. My old desktop computer, a relic by today's standards, whirred and groaned as I scanned documents, digitized photographs, and transcribed snippets of audio recordings. My fingers, stiff with age, fumbled with the mouse. But my mind was sharp, focused. Each piece of evidence was a stone in the foundation of the case I was building, a testament to 2 decades of patient, painful observation. There were moments, of course, when the sheer audacity of what I was planning, what I had been doing for so long, threatened to overwhelm me. I remembered the first time I consciously decided to document their deceit. It was about 15 years ago. Sarah had called, bubbling with excitement about a church leadership retreat in the Caribbean. Alistair, she said, needed to recharge his spiritual batteries. The church, of course, was footing the bill. A few weeks later, a misdirected postcard arrived in my mailbox. Not from a humble retreat center, but from a 5-star resort in St. Bart's, showing Alistair and Sarah, tanned and beaming, champagne flutes in hand, on the deck of a private yacht. The message was brief. "Paradise. Wish you were here. Not really. Love, S.I.L." The casual cruelty of that "not really" was like a slap. I felt a cold anger settle in my heart. That postcard became the first entry in my ledger. One of my most crucial pieces of evidence came quite by accident, or perhaps by a nudge from a higher power that sees more clearly than any of us. About 10 years ago, I had purchased a small digital voice recorder. I told Sarah it was to help me remember hymns, or perhaps record parts of Alistair's sermons for later reflection, a plausible excuse. One afternoon, Sarah had borrowed my car to run an errand, her own expensive import being in the shop. I had, quite by chance, left the recorder tucked into the side pocket of the driver's door, switched on. When she returned the car, I retrieved the recorder, intending to erase whatever ambient noise it had picked up. Instead, I found a conversation. A conversation between Alistair and Sarah on speakerphone in my car that made my blood run cold. "The auditors are getting nosy about the mission funds," Alistair had said, his voice tight with irritation. "Darling, just do what you always do," Sarah's voice, syrupy and conspiratorial, replied. "Move it through the Genesis account, then into the offshore. They will never trace it. These hicks in the congregation, they believe anything you tell them. Bless their simple hearts." I know," Alistair grumbled. "It is just tedious. All this paperwork to cover our tracks. Sometimes I think it would be easier to just run a hedge fund." Sarah had laughed, a tinkling, unpleasant sound. "But then, you would not get to play God every Sunday, my love, and where is the fun in that?" I sat in my quiet apartment, the recorder clutched in my trembling hand, tears streaming down my face. Hicks. Simple hearts. Play God. The callous disdain, the calculated deception. It was all there. That recording became a cornerstone of my collection. Then there was the anonymous tip. Several years ago, a plain manila envelope with no return address appeared in my church mailbox. Inside, on cheap copy paper, were printouts of what looked like offshore bank account statements in Alistair's name, showing substantial balances and transfers from accounts I recognized as shell corporations he used for his ministries. I never found out who sent it. Perhaps a disgruntled former employee or a conflicted member of his inner circle. I guarded those papers as if they were gold, another layer of undeniable proof. My biggest challenge was technology. My old computer often froze, the scanner jammed, and the software was a confusing maze of icons and menus. There were days I wanted to throw the whole contraption out the window, but I persevered, poring over online tutorials meant for people a quarter of my age, slowly, painstakingly teaching myself the rudiments of file management, image editing, and audio trimming. I learned to be discreet. Church staff, under the guise of wellness checks that felt more like surveillance, would occasionally pop in. My work would be instantly hidden, the computer switched off, the papers tucked back into their locked box. I was just Esther, the quiet old lady, reading her Bible or tending her herbs. The first person I decided to trust was Martha Gable. Martha was a widow in her mid-70s, a devout member of Hope Community since its early days. Her late husband, John, had been a kind, hard-working man, and together they had tithed generously, believing wholeheartedly in Alistair's vision. Martha now lived on a modest pension, yet her contributions to the church remained unwavering. I invited her for tea one afternoon. "Martha," I began gently, after we had exchanged pleasantries, "you and John have always been such pillars of this church. Your faith is an inspiration." Martha smiled, a sad, sweet smile. "John believed so strongly in Pastor Alistair's work, Esther. He always said, 'You cannot outgive God.' So I continue to do my part." My heart ached for her. "And the church appreciates it, I am sure," I said. Then taking a deep breath, "Martha, do you remember the special appeal last year for the mission in Guatemala? Pastor Alistair spoke so movingly about the children there." "Oh, yes," she said, her eyes brightening. "We all gave generously. John and I had always sponsored a child there, even before Pastor Alistair highlighted the need." I reached into a folder I had prepared. "This was supposedly a photograph from that mission trip," I said, laying down a glossy brochure image of Alistair, looking solemn, surrounded by impoverished children. Then, I placed another photograph beside it, one taken from a gossip website's social media feed, showing Alistair and Sarah laughing on the deck of a massive yacht, the azure waters of the French Riviera sparkling behind them. The date stamp on the online photo coincided exactly with the dates of the Guatemala mission. Martha stared at the photos, her brow furrowed. "But this must be a mistake. This cannot be right." "Look at the dates, Martha. Look at the watch he is wearing in both photos. The one he said was a gift from a grateful parishioner." Martha picked up the yacht photo, her hand trembling. She traced the outline of Sarah's expensive sunglasses, Alistair's smug grin. The color drained from her face. Tears welled in her eyes. "All these years," she whispered, her voice cracking. "All our sacrifices. For this?" The anger came next, a slow burn that replaced the shock. "That man," she said, her voice low and fierce, "has made a mockery of God's house, a mockery of John's memory." She looked at me then, her eyes filled with a new, steely resolve. "Esther, what do you need me to do?" Martha suggested we approach David Lee. David was a retired accountant in his early 60s, a church elder who served on the finance committee. He was known for his quiet integrity and meticulous nature. He had always been a staunch supporter of Alistair, but Martha had sensed a growing unease in him during recent committee meetings. We met David in a quiet corner of the church library. He listened patiently, his expression skeptical, as I laid out my concerns. He was polite, but clearly unconvinced. "Esther, Martha," he said gently, "Pastor Alistair is a good man. Perhaps there are explanations for these things. The pressures of leadership are immense." I knew then I had to show him something irrefutable, something that would speak to his accountant's soul. I presented him with a set of documents. Photocopies of expense reports Alistair had submitted for ministry-related travel some years back. First-class flights, 5-star hotels, lavish meals. Beside them, I placed receipts for those same trips, receipts I had painstakingly retrieved. A sympathetic janitor, an elderly man named Joseph, whom I often chatted with about his grandchildren, had occasionally found interesting items in the trash bins from Alistair's private office suite and, knowing my quiet disapproval of the pastor's excesses, had discreetly passed them to me. The receipts showed the actual costs were often significantly lower. The expenses inflated on the reports submitted to the church for reimbursement. Some ministry expenses were for personal shopping sprees for Sarah, disguised as gifts for dignitaries. David Lee studied the documents, his face growing grimmer with each page. He compared the figures, his lips moving silently. The careful, methodical fraud, the sheer petty greed layered on top of the larger deceptions, clearly shook him. This is unconscionable," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of horror and dawning respect. "I will need to look into the current financials, discreetly. If this is true, then we have a grave problem." David agreed to help, to use his position on the finance committee to find more current evidence. The Week of Hope campaign launched with a deafening media blitz. Alistair's face, benevolent and inspiring, was everywhere. On billboards that lined the freeways, in television spots that ran during prime time, on glossy flyers stuffed into mailboxes. Sarah was always by his side, her expression one of beatific devotion, a carefully curated image of wifely support. Donations began to pour in, announced daily with triumphant fanfare from the pulpit. Alistair's arrogance seemed to inflate with each passing day. During one televised interview, Sarah, wearing a new diamond necklace that glittered under the studio lights, spoke tearfully about the blessings of giving and the joy of sacrifice. The hypocrisy was a physical weight, pressing down on me, on Martha, on David. But it also fueled our determination. David, true to his word, began to find more recent irregularities, whispers of large, unexplained transfers. One evening, I found myself sitting alone in my small living room, the television off, the apartment quiet, except for the hum of the old refrigerator. I picked up a framed photograph from my nightstand. It was Sarah, aged 7, gap-toothed and grinning, holding a small, fluffy kitten. Her eyes in the photo were bright with an uncomplicated joy, a pure, innocent love for that tiny creature. Where had that girl gone? Had Alistair's influence, the relentless pursuit of wealth and status, completely extinguished that spark of compassion, that inherent goodness I knew had once resided in my daughter? A wave of profound sadness washed over me. Exposing Alistair meant exposing Sarah, too, shattering the gilded cage she had so willingly embraced. It was a mother's grief, sharp and piercing, for a child lost not to death, but to a slow, insidious corrosion of the soul. There would be no victory without this collateral damage, this deeply personal cost. A few days later, David Lee called an urgent, hushed meeting. He looked pale, his usual composure rattled. "I found it," he said, his voice low. "Alistair has set up a new shell corporation, registered just last month in the Cayman Islands. And I found internal memos, heavily encrypted, but I managed to get through, outlining a plan to divert nearly 70% of the Week of Hope funds into that account within days of the campaign concluding. The stated purpose for the corporation? Global outreach initiatives. It is a blatant front. This is not just skimming, Esther. This is grand larceny, planned and premeditated." This was it. The smoking gun. Irrefutable proof of large-scale, intentional fraud. Martha Gable, who had joined us, gasped. "The homeless outreach? It was all a lie?" "All of it," David confirmed, his face grim. It was Martha who then remembered Leo Maxwell. "Leo," she said thoughtfully. "Young Leo Maxwell, who volunteers in the media department, he is a computer whiz. I remember him mentioning to me once, a while back, that he was uncomfortable with some of the invoices for new media equipment, said they seemed vastly inflated. He was just a boy then, too scared to say anything more. Leo was our next target. He was in his late 20s, bright, energetic, and initially, a fervent admirer of Pastor Alistair. We approached him cautiously. David laid out the financial evidence, the shell corporations, the planned diversion of funds. I showed him the photos, the recordings of Alistair and Sarah's private contempt for the congregation. Leo listened, his initial skepticism slowly giving way to a horrified disbelief. He had idolized Alistair, seen him as a spiritual guide. The disillusionment was stark on his young face. I had suspicions," he admitted, his voice trembling slightly. "Things that did not add up. Pastor Finch always insisted on the most expensive equipment, even when more affordable options would do, and his private demeanor, it was so different from his public persona." He looked at the evidence spread before him, the sheer weight of the deceit. The homeless outreach. My own mother donated to that. She barely has enough for herself. The final piece that convinced him was the plan to divert the Week of Hope funds. That direct theft from the most vulnerable cause Alistair had championed broke through Leo's remaining hesitation. "He cannot be allowed to do this," Leo said, his voice hardening with a newfound resolve. What do you need me to do?" Leo revealed he had high-level access to the main presentation systems for the auditorium, and crucially, to the live stream feed that went out to thousands online and to the television networks. He could, he said, override the scheduled programming. The plan began to form, audacious and terrifying. We would create a video, a compilation of Alistair and Sarah's luxuries, the damning financial documents, the audio recordings, all set against the backdrop of Alistair's own hypocritical sermons. And Leo would play it during Alistair's keynote address, at the very height of the Week of Hope. It was a point of no return for all of us. Failure meant not just public humiliation, but potentially serious legal consequences if Alistair decided to retaliate. But the thought of Alistair succeeding, of him walking away with millions more, of the congregation being duped yet again, was unbearable. We were in this together, bound by a shared purpose, to bring the truth to light. Alistair, however, was not entirely oblivious. Perhaps David Lee's careful but persistent questions in finance committee meetings had raised a subtle alarm. Or perhaps his own paranoia, a common companion to the deceitful, was simply heightened. A few days before the keynote event, he announced enhanced security protocols for the auditorium and the media booth, including stricter control over all media inputs and a new firewall system. Leo's face fell when he heard the news. "This complicates things," he said grimly. "They are bringing in an external tech team loyal to Alistair to oversee the system on the day." Our carefully laid plan suddenly seemed fragile. The Week of Hope was in its final, frantic days. Fundraising thermometers displayed in the church lobby showed donations soaring past the $50 million mark. Alistair was ecstatic, his sermons even more grandiose, his pronouncements more divine. Sarah, caught up in the euphoria, was openly discussing plans for a victory celebration trip to Tuscany with her society friends. The pressure on our small group was immense. We worked feverishly, in stolen moments, to finalize the video. Leo, pale with stress but driven, spent hours trying to devise a workaround for the new security measures. He believed he had found a vulnerability, a backdoor into an older, supposedly decommissioned backup system that the external tech crew would likely overlook. It was risky, very risky. Meanwhile, David Lee, using a secure email address, had contacted an investigative journalist, a woman named Susan Vance, from a reputable national newspaper known for its exposé pieces. He sent her a carefully curated dossier of evidence, enough to pique her interest without revealing our entire hand or our identities. Susan Vance was intrigued. She agreed to watch the live stream of Alistair's keynote sermon and, if the information seemed credible, to launch a full investigation. The day before Alistair's keynote, disaster struck. David Lee called me, his voice tight with panic. "Esther, Alistair just ordered a full diagnostic of the entire media system, including all backups. He is bringing in that external tech crew tonight, not tomorrow. He said something about wanting to ensure flawless broadcast quality for his big speech. If they find what Leo has set up..." My heart sank. 20 years. 20 years of meticulous work, of silent suffering, of carefully hoarded hope, all about to be undone by a last-minute whim, a flicker of pastoral paranoia. I felt a crushing wave of despair. Perhaps Alistair was too powerful, too protected. Perhaps I had been a fool to think I, an old woman with a box of secrets, could ever bring down such an empire. I considered calling Leo, telling him to abort the plan, to save himself. That afternoon, Sarah visited. It was not out of concern or even curiosity about my well-being. She swept into my small apartment, her eyes appraising my simple dress with a familiar disdain. "Mother," she said, her voice brisk, "Alistair's keynote is tomorrow. It is going to be a historic event for the church. Please, try not to embarrass us. I brought you something." She handed me a garment bag. Inside was a dress, a polyester sheath, several seasons out of style, in a drab beige color that did nothing for my complexion. It was clearly one of her cast-offs, something she would not be caught dead in. "At least try to look presentable," she said, not unkindly, but with the casual cruelty of someone who had long since stopped seeing me as a person with feelings. "Alistair is making history. The least you can do is not look like a charity case from the pews." Her words, meant to diminish, to reinforce my place as the insignificant old mother, had the opposite effect. The cheap, discarded dress, the casual assumption of my irrelevance, it was the final insult, the last drop in a cup already overflowing with 20 years of slights and humiliations. A cold, hard anger, pure and clarifying, washed away my despair. Sarah was lost, utterly lost. My daughter was a stranger who looked out at me from familiar eyes, and Alistair Finch would not win. I called an emergency meeting with Leo, Martha, and David in my apartment that evening. The atmosphere was thick with tension. When I told them about Alistair's planned diagnostic, Leo went white. But then, after a moment of panicked silence, a spark of defiance lit his eyes. "The main backup system. They will check that," he said, thinking aloud. "But there is an older one, a really old one. It is technically still patched in, but everyone thinks it was decommissioned years ago. It is not on any of the current schematics. If I can route the signal through that, the quality might not be perfect, but it is our only shot." It was a desperate gamble. But looking at their determined faces, at Martha's quiet resolve, David's grim determination, and Leo's newfound courage, I knew we had to try. "He has underestimated us all for the last time," I said, my voice steady. "Tomorrow, the world will see Alistair Finch for who he truly is. And they will see Sarah for who she has become." The doors of the Hope Community megachurch were set to open in a few hours. Thousands would flock to hear Pastor Alistair Finch deliver his message of hope and sacrifice, to celebrate the astonishing success of the Week of Hope. He had his sermon notes, meticulously prepared, filled with soaring rhetoric and emotional appeals. I had mine, and mine were illustrated. The morning of Alistair's keynote sermon dawned bright and clear, a beautiful day for a reckoning. I dressed carefully, not in the drab beige dress Sarah had offered, but in a simple, dignified navy blue suit that Arthur had always liked. I felt his presence with me, a quiet strength at my back. Martha Gable, her face pale, but her eyes resolute, met me near the entrance. We walked in together, two old women nearly invisible in the surging crowd of thousands making their way into the cavernous auditorium. David Lee was already seated in the elders section near the front, looking composed, though I could see the tension in his jaw. Leo, I knew, was in the media booth, a small, almost forgotten room tucked high above the stage, his fingers no doubt hovering over the laptop that held our meticulously compiled video. Susan Vance, the investigative journalist, had confirmed she would be watching the live stream intently. The atmosphere inside was electric. Uplifting music swelled, lights swept across the cheering crowd. Then a hush fell as Pastor Alistair Finch strode onto the stage, immaculate in a tailored dark suit, his silver hair gleaming under the spotlights. He exuded confidence, power, an almost divine aura that held the congregation spellbound. Sarah sat in the front row, beaming at him, the picture of adoring devotion, her diamond necklace flashing. Alistair began to speak, his voice a rich, resonant instrument, weaving a tapestry of hope and inspiration. He spoke of the needy, the downtrodden, the miracle of the week of hope, and the generosity of the faithful. He built his sermon to a powerful crescendo, tears appearing to glisten in his eyes as he described the fictional homeless children whose lives would supposedly be transformed by the new outreach center. "And so I ask you," he cried, his arms outstretched, his voice thundering through the auditorium. "Open your hearts, open your wallets. Give until it feels like a true sacrifice. For the glory of God and the work of this ministry, let us show the world what faith in action can achieve." As people reached for the special Week of Hope donation envelopes, as ushers began to move through the aisles, it happened. The massive screens behind Alistair, which had been displaying inspirational images of sunsets and soaring eagles, flickered. For a split second, they went dark. Alistair paused, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face, assuming a technical glitch. Then, the screens came alive again. But instead of eagles, there was Alistair grinning on the deck of a luxury yacht, champagne flute in hand, Sarah beside him in a designer bikini. Then a quick cut to their opulent mansion, its manicured lawns and swimming pool. Images of expensive cars, receipts for $5,000 handbags, close-ups of lavish jewelry. Interspersed were scanned documents, offshore bank statements with staggering balances, deeds to properties held in shell corporations, forged expense reports, all overlaid with Alistair's own voice, captured on that accidental recording. These hicks in the congregation, they believe anything you tell them. Bless their simple hearts. And Sarah's chilling laughter. The audio of their conversation, discussing how to hide assets, their contempt for their flock, filled the auditorium. The contrast between Alistair's sanctimonious stage persona and the raw, vulgar greed revealed on the screens was devastating. A collective gasp swept through the crowd. Stunned silence, then murmurs, then shouts of disbelief and outrage. Alistair froze, his smile vanishing, replaced by a mask of utter shock, then dawning horror, then pure, incandescent rage. He spun towards the media booth, his mouth opening and closing like a stranded fish. In the front row, Sarah's face went ashen. She stared at the screens, her eyes wide with terror. Then she made a small, choked sound and slumped forward in a faint. The video, our meticulously crafted presentation of God's true accounting, played for a full 5 minutes. It ended with a simple text overlay. "Where does your tithe truly go? Judge for yourselves." And then my own voice, calm and clear, recorded in my little apartment, filled the silence. "This is the truth, and the truth, as the pastor often says, will set you free." Alistair finally found his voice. "Cut it!" he bellowed, his face contorted. "Cut that feed! Treason! Sabotage!" But Leo, bless his brave young heart, had anticipated this. The main control panel was unresponsive. The images and my voice remained burning into the consciousness of everyone present and everyone watching online. The immediate aftermath was pandemonium. People were standing, shouting, some weeping openly. Ushers and security personnel looked bewildered, unsure how to react. David Lee, seizing the moment, strode onto the stage with 2 other reform-minded elders who had long harbored private doubts. David took the microphone from the now silent pulpit. "My brothers and sisters," he said, his voice firm and clear, "please, remain calm. It appears we have been gravely deceived. There will be an immediate, independent investigation into all church finances. All Week of Hope donations will be frozen pending this investigation." Alistair, sputtering with rage, tried to grab the microphone from David, but his own microphone, the one clipped to his lapel, had gone dead, another of Leo's quiet contributions. Security, finally galvanized, moved towards the stage, not to restore Alistair's control, but to escort him and a now revived, hysterical Sarah away through a side door amidst a chorus of jeers and angry cries. Susan Vance, the journalist, was already on her phone, dictating the lead of her story, her photographer snapping pictures of the chaos. The carefully constructed empire of Alistair Finch had crumbled in 5 short minutes. In the days and weeks that followed, the scandal exploded onto the national stage. Susan Vance's article, filled with damning details from our dossier and eyewitness accounts of the service, went viral. Other news outlets picked up the story. The IRS launched an immediate investigation. The FBI followed, looking into wire fraud, mail fraud, and money laundering. Alistair and Sarah's assets were frozen, their mansions seized. They faced a mountain of legal charges. Their reputation was in ashes. Martha Gable became a quiet hero to many in the congregation, helping to organize support groups for those who felt betrayed, guiding them towards healing. Leo Maxwell, after ensuring all the evidence was securely in the hands of the authorities and the interim church board, quietly resigned from his volunteer position and moved to another state to pursue his tech career away from the fallout. David Lee was instrumental in helping to restructure the church's finances and leadership, working to restore some measure of trust. Sarah attempted to contact me. She left a tearful, rambling voicemail, blaming Alistair for everything, painting herself as a victim of his manipulation, begging for my understanding, my forgiveness. I listened to it once, then deleted it. Later, she came to my apartment, her face pale and drawn, stripped of its usual expensive makeup, her designer clothes looking out of place in my simple surroundings. She wept, she pleaded, she tried to appeal to my maternal instincts. I listened calmly. When she was finished, I looked her in the eye. "Sarah," I said, my voice gentle but firm, "you made your choices. For 20 years, you made them every single day. You chose the luxury, you chose the lies, you chose to stand by him and mock the very people whose sacrifices paid for your lifestyle. These," I gestured around her, to the world that was now collapsing, "are the consequences of those choices. Forgiveness is not mine to give for what you did to the church. As for what you did to me, to our family, that is a longer road. And it begins with you truly understanding the depth of your own complicity." There was no easy reconciliation. Perhaps, someday, a sliver of the daughter I once knew might re-emerge from the wreckage, but she would have to find her own way to true remorse. I was approached by many church members, some with tears in their eyes, thanking me for my courage, for opening their eyes. I did not seek recognition, but it was a quiet balm to my old wounds to know that the truth had made a difference. Eventually, I moved out of the small apartment on the church grounds. I found a modest, comfortable cottage with a small garden, using a small inheritance Arthur had left me years ago, money I had carefully saved, untouched by Alistair's grasping reach. I spent my days reading, tending my roses, and enjoying the simple peace I had fought so long and hard to achieve. One afternoon, I took out the locked wooden box from the old secretary desk, which now sat in my new sunlit living room. I looked at the ledgers, the photographs, the USB drives, the chronicle of 2 decades of deceit. Then I closed the lid and locked it. I did not need it anymore. The truth was out, living and breathing in the world. Alistair had called me a bitter old woman. Perhaps, in some ways, I had been. Bitterness can be a corrosive thing, but sometimes, I reflected, even bitterness when it springs from a deep well of injustice, can be a seed. And if tended with patience, watered with perseverance, and warmed by an unshakable belief in the truth, it can, eventually, flower into justice. Alistair Finch preached about a judgment day far off in the future, a day of trumpets and divine wrath. He never understood that accountability can arrive unannounced on a Tuesday morning, on flickering screens in his own sanctuary, heralded not by avenging angels but by the steady, persistent hand of an old woman he had dismissed. And sometimes, the greatest offering one can make is not money given in blind faith, but courage offered in the clear light of truth. Thank you for being with me through this entire story. It means the world to share it. If Esther's journey for justice resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel, give this video a thumbs up, and share your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing from you. Be sure to check out our other stories of resilience and truth. We hope to see you again in our next video. Goodbye for now.